Good morning. Thank you, everyone. I hope everyone's got their cup of coffee in hand and ready for a really exciting session, especially for me as a journalist. I mean, when they proposed to me to moderate this session, I think I jumped at the opportunity because most journalists in India are constantly grappling with definitions of free speech, hate speech, extreme speech, especially in the digital space that we inhabit, and frankly, the levers that the state has to either use kindly or harshly, depending on who is speaking. I suppose that's the way to put it. Thank you all for being here. I want to start with you, Farah, and ask you, in your book, you say that you started thinking about this question on a trip to China, and the question of censorship in China and that you were contending with. Tell us a little bit about, what triggered the question in your head.
Yeah, so thank you, Maya. It actually happened around about the time I last came to this fantastic festival when I published a book called The Origins of Sex, about the history of modern Western ideas about sex. And I came to the festival to talk about it. It's available in the bookshop. And at this festival, as elsewhere around the world that I spoke about that work, I realized, speaking about sex in public is different in different cultures. And I was continually coming across kind of small acts of censorship towards me. I said fuck on BBC Radio late one night, and it was very, very problematic, and the producer didn't shake my hand. And there's a parental warning on the iPlayer still today because I did that. And I was deplatformed once, again in Oxford. I was invited to a literary festival to talk about the book, and the lecture was going to be in a church, and the day before I got a very embarrassed email from the organizer saying, "We're very sorry, the clergy of the church in Jericho have refused permission for your lecture because, quote, it's incompatible with the sacred nature of the space." So anyway, then I went to China, and that really blew me away because I'd been experiencing these funny episodes, but China, even then, and even more so today, is a horrible totalitarian dictatorship where the state censors everyone around the clock in unimaginably efficient and effective ways. And I came back from that trip realizing that I actually believe in free speech, and we all believe in free speech, and it's a fantastically important principle for democratic societies, but why could we never agree on it? Why do we always disagree about free speech within our cultures, across cultures? And so I tried to figure out where this idea had come from, how we'd arrived at the moment of mass chaos that we seem to be living in 2015. I thought, I must hurry up, clearly this is the peak of free speech craziness, 2015, and soon we'll be figuring out how to deal with this problem, and my book will not be relevant anymore. It took me 10 years, and I'm afraid we're still muddled. But I explain in the book why that is. It's a historical problem, and it's an insoluble one, sadly. I don't have clear, straight, simple answers, and that's part of the difficulty of our world today. We all want simple answers to free speech. We want a clear definition, and then we want to stop thinking about it and be able to apply that, and it's never going to work.
Right. We'll get into the sort of details of sort of absolutist free speech in the United States and the reasonable restrictions we have in India and take that a little further. But before I do that, Sai, I'd like to bring you in to this conversation as well, because you've written a very interesting book on the presidential pardon in the United States. Now, in the last year or so, we've seen several pardons that have been granted by presidential ordinance decree. Is the presidential pardon an act of neutrality? Is it, because both free speech and the presidential pardon claim a basis in neutrality and in the public interest and in the interest of the citizen, but is that the way it's been exercised or is being exercised?
Well, first of all, it's a delight to be with you here today. It's a treat and a pleasure. I don't think the presidential pardon is an exercise of neutrality. It's an exercise of judgment, sometimes good judgment, sometimes bad judgment, sometimes a political judgment about who ought to get mercy, right? There are laws on the books related to crimes and other offenses. And in the American system and in the Indian system, there's a sense that there's a need to mitigate those laws in some way, that some punishments are too harsh. There's also a sense that sometimes people that are innocent have been punished, and there needs to be a way of undoing that punishment. And so, every system in the world has some form of clemency, and the trick is who gets to exercise it under what circumstances. And what we're grappling with in America now is the unlimited discretion given to the president to hand out this form of clemency, and the use of clemency for what you might think are inappropriate or nefarious purposes, where the president is pardoning people who've contributed to his campaign, pardoning family members, pardoning political allies. And it's now the case that presidents are running for the office of president promising pardons, which of course will get them votes, right? And so now you're seeing people say, vote for me, ... I'll give you a pardon, or I'll give your loved one a pardon. And those are relatively new things that pose fundamental questions about the advisability of the pardon power.
So one of the things that you kind of talk about in your book is the question of the public placing trust in the concept of the presidential pardon, that it's basically to either, like you said, an appeal or to correct an injustice that may have been carried out in the course of the judicial process, etc. But the examples that we're looking at in the last year, do you think that trust is now misplaced?
Well, the way it works, Maya, is the pardon power is in the Constitution, independent of whether people today want it to be there. And so people today don't think about necessarily why it's in the Constitution. It's just a fact of the world,
right, that
the president can do it. You're right that people are apprehensive of how it's being used today. So that's changed, right? That more people are apprehensive today than they would have been, say, 2 or 3 years ago. But they're not thinking of it in terms of, well, here are the 5 reasons. I mean, the book tells, here are the 5 reasons why we have a pardon power, and hopefully gives people tools to think about whether the president's misusing the power. But what typically happens, most people, unfortunately aren't going to read the book. They need to, but they're not going to. They're thinking about the particular situation, they're seeing who's being pardoned, and they're making a judgment about whether this was a good use of the pardon power or not. And as is true in many societies, your sense of that will be colored by your perception of the president. If you think the president's doing a great job, is a wonderful person, you're going to give this president a benefit of the doubt. If you don't think that, you're more apt to think that it's being misused. And it's the people in the middle that really matter in terms of whether there's a majority in favor of any particular pardon or not. But as you know, as a formal journalist, there's thousands of stories every day, and it's hard to get people's attention. But if the president continually pardons people that are contributing to his campaign and voiding literally hundreds of millions of dollars of fines, that will rise above the din, and people will focus, and then they will look for my book and find the answers.
And ask the questions, right? Okay.
Right.
Judge Shah, Ketu, I don't know, will I be held in contempt if I don't call you judge?
Not at all.
Not at all. Okay, good. So you adjudicate on so many of these cases. I want to ask you, firstly, have you had to adjudicate on a free speech case? And if so, could you just tell us a little bit about how that works in the courtroom where you're in? And from your perspective, the question that I want Farah to come in on as well after you speak is the differences and the divergences in the US version and the Indian version of our definitions of free speech, because it's either all or nothing, I mean, depending on where you're standing. So maybe start with an example, because I'm really curious.
Thank you, Maya, for that excellent question, and thank you all to the panelists and the audience. I'm reminded of a story in law school when we were in studies. They would often say, professors and other guest lecturers, that, the people who get A's in law school, they'll wind up going to become brilliant professors. The B students will go on to become good lawyers, and the C students will become judges. And so, I'm very thrilled to be with this distinguished panel. And we had, during the COVID time, there were quite a few challenges about free speech within our state and in our court. And people were, I think, arguing that they had some free speech rights to say what they wanted to say about vaccines, and then also do what they wanted to do in their workplace. And Washington took a very cautionary approach and tried to mandate vaccines to everybody, and so some people disagreed with that. And so some of those cases came to our court, and we had to, work through those problems of free speech and ability to do what you wanted to do. There was sort of a corollary, a freedom of religion argument that came along with that as well. And so these issues raise kind of fundamental constitutional rights versus sort of the community's interest in keeping it healthy and safe for everybody. And so we had to grapple with some of those issues that came up. And most of our courts all sort of found that there were good reasons and good exceptions to balance in favor of community safety and health versus those individual rights. And that is a constant balancing that we as judges are doing when we're faced with individual rights like freedom of speech and others versus the sort of safety of everybody. The classic example, of course, in school is that can you yell fire in a crowded theater? And of course you can't, because that would jeopardize the safety of everyone in that theater. And so from there we build this analysis and we look at different tools to figure out what is going to harm the community, and does that outweigh some fundamental individual rights?
Right. Farah, I want you to come in on this, because, I mean, there's a sort of moral high ground that free speech absolutists also take. I mean, and the argument that the ones who argue for restriction also say that, well, it has to come with responsibility. So you have the right to free speech, but you have responsibility. The question is, who is determining what is responsible free speech? What kind of restrictions there should be? I mean, you've given the example of the school example of you can't yell fire in a crowded theater because there'll be a stampede. But I think it goes deeper than that, especially in the world that we live in today. And so therefore, the question is, how do you create that distinction?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, free speech is a very old idea because it takes many different forms. That's one thing we often lose sight of when we try to think of it as a single thing. Free speech for artists is one thing, free speech for scholars, freedom of religion has elements of free speech. But our modern idea of free speech, really the core of that is that every citizen has a right to speak out on matters of public concern. And that is a relatively new concept of free speech. That's invented in the 18th century, as I show in my book. And ever since that moment, there have been basically only two ways of defining it as a legal right. One is absolutist, if we can use that term, and there's only one place in the world where people write that down in that form of words, and that is the United States. The First Amendment says there shall be no law. You shall make law, Congress shall make no law regarding the freedom of speech and the liberty of the press. In the rest of the world, people have always taken the balanced view, if that's the best way of putting it, which is that freedom of speech is an important individual right, but it is also something that needs to be used responsibly. It can cause harm, and so you balance the right against the responsibility not to abuse it. And those abuses then can be defined by law. And harm, as you put it quite rightly, is the most important criterion then. I show in my book, there are many ironies here. The Americans, in the same year as the First Amendment is adopted by Congress, 1789, realized that across the Atlantic in Paris, the French have come up with this balancing formulation of the French Declaration of Rights. And when they see that across the Eastern Seaboard, people open their newspapers and say, oh, that looks like a better way of formulating it. And then they incorporate that into domestic law across all the states of the United States. It's completely unnoticed historical fact. And so the modern interpretation of the First Amendment in the very absolutist, hardcore way that we now take for granted is actually very recent. It only dates back to the 1960s, as I also explain in great and fascinating detail in my book. But anyway, now we have those two models. The first thing to say is that it is, in some sense, a false distinction. Everyone who's the balancing model in mind does believe strongly that this is an important principle that deserves the maximum space to work. Everyone who's an absolutist also take Elon Musk, for example, thinks that there are certain kinds of speech that shouldn't be allowed. No one should be broadcasting the location of his aeroplane, for example. That's clearly harmful, he says. Can't do that.
To him.
To him. So, I mean, it's a rhetorical battle. You start with either with individual liberty that you think is the most important thing in the world, or you start with the public good, the common good, and take it from there. So this is partly rhetorical. But one thing that gets lost in the middle of it, and you asked about who should decide these things, is that we tend to think of it just as, on the one hand, the right of the individual, and on the other hand, the power of the government. And in the modern world, that is completely insufficient. And ever since the 19th century, people who've thought about this in sophisticated ways have noticed it's insufficient because it leaves out the very important bit in the middle, which is the power of amplification, the power of the mass media in particular, to suppress certain voices, amplify others, to spread information very widely indeed.
And now the algorithm determines that on digital
we're
media.
absolutely in a world where that is the most important and completely unregulated power in most countries. And because these are things that are now dominated by greedy American corporations, there's an additional problem, which is that they, on the one hand, take for granted the platitudes of the First Amendment. You can't really cause harm through speech. The only solution is more speech. And on the other hand, they're backed by the current administration, which is pushing for all sorts of reasons, for greater and greater freedom for these corporations to do whatever they like in any country around the world.
So, Sai, I'd like to come to you with a slightly tangential question, because I'm glad you brought up the question of the mass media and the algorithm. You know, it's been a challenge even for journalists to actually negotiate that line between what the algorithm does to your own work as a journalist. But there's been a huge global debate on how to regulate platforms, speech. Do you think that, including the question of the pardon, that now, given the kind of the nature of information and how it circulates globally, there needs to be some sort of global set of regulations across the board for speech, for jurisprudence? How do we negotiate this space?
Well, this is not my area, and I would defer to Fara, but I'm of the view that a diversity of approaches is appropriate, that what is permissible in one state doesn't need to be permissible in another state. I mean, I do believe in freedom of political speech quite strongly, but so I would think that, for personally, I would prefer that everywhere, but beyond that, I'm not sure that the hate speech versus regulation of hate speech versus no regulation needs to be the same everywhere. Farah is right that there's no regulation of hate speech in America. You can say anything hateful about any group that you want to, and you can't be prosecuted. That's obviously not the case here in India. And I think it works okay in America. I don't really see a problem with that approach there. I think there might be a problem here because of reactions that would ensue in the wake of hate speech. But even America has a fighting speech doctrine. If you say certain words to a person and it's expected that there will be a fight ensuing, that can be regulated, right? So that's, it's not quite absolutist. You can't literally say anything to anybody and expect that you won't be held to account for it. So there, as far as that, it's not fully absolutist. There are nuances and exceptions that maybe the most absolutists would reject, but they nonetheless exist, and they've existed for centuries there.
And have there been pardons or political interventions in the case where speech has been the charge?
Well, I mean, Farah is absolutely right that compared to most countries, speech is, we'll say, the most free in America, which makes it very difficult to prosecute someone for what they say, which then makes it very difficult to pardon someone. If there are very few prosecutions for what you say, there's very few occasions to pardon the people who say things that result in prosecution.
Right. You wanted to come in on that.
Yeah, I was just going to add, and this issue, this problem is being grappled with at the state's level. For example, in our state, there's a law called you cannot violate malicious harassment. And this has been expanded recently as people's attitudes have changed about what constitutes harassment. And malicious harassment is intended for hate speech, for people who speak against a specific group because of their identity, because of their qualities. And just as you say, Sai, those cases, though, are not often prosecuted because it is difficult to prove the intent element of that crime. You have the intent to harm somebody through your words, and because of their discrete identification, whether it's race, gender, sexual orientation, or what have you. And it is evolving. And you know, 20 years ago, there was almost none of these charges being brought. In the last year or two, there's probably been about 30 to 50 charges. And so it's evolving as they go, and you know, people are evaluating whether that speech is intended to harm, in this case, very specifically for a particular group.
So I want to ask you as well, in terms of the courts and what happens. You're saying that the cases have gone up significantly in the last couple of years. But do you feel that because we live in the digital age and there are these questions about regulation and the kind of influence that these platforms have globally, they operate based on the laws of the country that they're registered in, but those laws may not be applicable in another country, and yet the platform is accessible in another country. And I mean, we've seen those cases in India oftentimes where whether it's journalists getting trolled, whether it is you know, religious hate speech that's being used to target communities, and the platforms are not in a position to divulge information without like a I'm not saying that they should divulge all information, but I think the question is where is the line of engagement for the public good on this question?
It's an excellent question. I'll give you an example. We as judges have seen a dramatic increase in the last year across the country of harassing, threatening, intimidating attacks, and it has mostly come through social media and so forth. And we have investigations going about whether these kinds of threats are will be acted upon. And again, back to the issue is, how do you figure out if someone is really intending to act on these vile and awful statements? It's difficult. And because they have to go through the process of subpoenaing the records from this company to get their information, whoever's making these comments, often they are using platforms that are based outside of the country. And so the subpoena power is unable to reach those locations, and so it's difficult to establish who is actually making the threat or harassing behavior. So you're right, exactly right, that it is very difficult when it's across borders, across countries, to figure out who is making these statements and how do you hold them to account when they rise to that level of intimidation and threats.
Okay, Fara, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to come in because, I mean, it's a depressing conversation so far, and the world is a complete mess when it comes to free speech and regulating and so on. But I hope a historical perspective might be useful in that what we're living through is a communications, a technological revolution.
Right.
That's part of the problem. That's why free speech has suddenly become such a hot issue in the last 10, 20 years. That always happens when you have a communications revolution. It goes right back to the 18th century and the explosion of print.
Correct.
And then the mass media, and then the radio, and then the television. At every such point, there's been a renewed engagement with the question of what is free speech, how far should it go, where are the limits, who should draw them, etc. But what's distinctive about our own age, in a bad way, is that at every previous point, people have basically taken the view that a new powerful mass medium needs to be restricted so that it acts not just for profit and greed and shareholders and owners, but also in the public interest. Because if you have this great power to shape public opinion, then surely you also have a responsibility to do that for the public good. And so these principles are part of what we think of as, well, part of the law in things like publishing print. There's libel laws, there's slander. You can't just lie. You can't do defamatory speech on television, even in the United States. And so all of these previous mass media have these forms of regulation. They often have arm's length bodies set up specifically to regulate them, as the FCC was set up in the 1930s in the United States to regulate radio broadcasting in the public interest. This is absolutely front and center. All countries have this. Until the 1990s, when the internet's fundamental laws were formulated in the United States, it was the moment of peak free market enthusiasm. The idea that the communist bloc had fallen, and so liberal democracy was the end point of history, made people extraordinarily over-enthusiastic about the idea that market forces would be able to solve everything, and governments should just get out of the way. And so the law of the internet includes this extraordinary, famous clause 230, section 230 in the United States law, saying internet companies, on the one hand, have the right to censor anything that anyone posts without any explanation at all, and on the other hand, have absolutely no responsibility for what is posted on their platforms. And that's complete carte blanche for irresponsible, greedy, spread of lies and misinformation, as they are doing all the time. And what we need to do as societies is to remember that this is atypical, is wrong, is problematic, and to treat them for what they are, which is publishers. They are publishers. They are the greatest, most powerful publishers the world has ever seen. We should treat them as we treat other publishers. That's to say, they have a responsibility for what they are amplifying and publishing, and they should take some responsibility for that, as well as some giant profits.
Right. So you wanted to come in on that. And also, if you could touch upon the powers of the state in these times, in this sort of the polarization, the religious divisions, the identity politics, how much is that now beginning to influence, state decisions and interventions in jurisprudence?
So I'm not on social media, so I don't really know what's being said, and it's a mental health decision on my part.
Very smart one.
It's a time management decision on my part. But I was going to go back to what you said earlier, which is, I think India and every other nation state can decide what it's going to permit in its borders, right? India does not have to permit Instagram or YouTube Shorts or any of these things in India. The American government, as many people know, just forced a company to sell itself to an American, ownership, right? I'm thinking, what is it? What was the company called? Was it Instagram?
TikTok.
TikTok. Yes. Yeah, I don't even know.
TikTok, Professor.
I'm not on it, so I don't know. But if every country has the sovereign right to decide whether it's going to allow these platforms on their territory, and they should make that decision, right? If TikTok or Facebook or whoever's not going to give the Indian government access to things that the Indian government thinks it needs, it should ban it.
But isn't that a slippery slope?
Well, it's like if you're going to do business in India, you have to follow the rules of India, right? You're not going to.
What happens in practice? Sorry to interrupt, but what happens in practice is these corporations, they don't engage with real dictatorships. So Facebook is not in China, they're not in Russia. They know that will look bad, and they'll just have to do what the state tells them. In authoritarian countries like India, they very happily go along with the abuses of the government and the authoritarian regime in Hungary, in Turkey, in India. Then they become partly weaponized by the government. Terrible things happened in Myanmar when Facebook went in and was taken over by such forces. And then the only place that they exercise their muscle is in Europe, where they push misinformation and deregulation as their right. They don't stand up, in other words, to authoritarian regimes. And that, I think, is a problem of power that needs to be grappled with. You can't just say, they need to operate according to the rules.
So don't you see this as like a structural problem then? Because yes, you're right that sovereign states should have the right to determine what's permissible within their borders. But the question is the government in those sovereign states making those determinations in self-interest or in public interest?
I think one of the fundamental axioms of politics is the people that are governing always think about their interest in staying in power. And so I think that's sort of inevitable. It's a problem. I thought your question was, well, some of these American companies aren't giving us access to their records, and I would say, well, then don't let them in your country, right? they don't have a right to be in your country any more than Indian companies have a right to be in other countries, right? These are all sovereign decisions that nation states make. There's more than 1 billion people in India. You don't need to have an American, company do your social networking or whatever the term is. You could have a market here. You could start a company here that would then do the same thing.
I think they tried that. It didn't quite.
I mean, it'll work. I mean, the Indians are very inventive. They don't need. It's not as if the Americans have a monopoly on social networking via internet platforms. Why would that be? It's not. We're not any better at posting, kitten videos. Anybody can do that, right? Or whatever it is, or lying, or or exaggerating, or we're not better than that at that.
Pretty good at exaggerating. Pretty good at exaggerating. I'm an American citizen too now, so I can say this. I mean, there are only 3 places in the world where people are trying, nations, societies are trying to grapple with the overmighty abuses of power of social media companies. One is Brazil, the second is the European Union, the third, not very effectively, but they're still trying, is the United Kingdom. And what they've done in those societies is to avoid the charge of censorship, which is a label that everyone immediately wants to apply to any form of regulation they don't agree with. They are doing things like simply saying to platforms, if you want to operate in our society, that's fine. If you want to make money from your publishing enterprise, fine. All we want to know is, are you doing so fairly, and are you doing so with regard to the public interest? So fairly means, tell us how and why you're amplifying certain voices and suppressing others, and certain messages and suppressing others. Are you doing that consistently and transparently, and not in some kind of hidden political or other bias built in? There are many right-wing as well as left-wing politicians in America who have been complaining about the hidden biases of the algorithm. And the other is show us the workings of what you're doing and how you are attending to harm.
So I just want to bring this back to you, Sai, in the question of political intervention, the pardon, things like that. In the digital age that we inhabit, do you think these decisions can be taken by the person in power without the influence and the pressures that come from being on these platforms? Because, I mean, the US president is very active on social media himself and keeps reaching out to people through his own platform, Truth Social, as well. Do you think that this kind of power can then be trusted in the hands of people who are also, converging their own self-interest again with political interest?
Well, I mean, I think it's, as I said earlier, it's always a temptation to use the power of the state when you're in charge of the state for your purposes. I think in America, Trump is concerned about his popularity. He's concerned about the next election. He can't, he wasn't able to win the last, the 2020 election, even though he was in power. And so I think he understands that public opinion matters. And so public opinion is shaped by the media. And so he is concerned about what is going on in social media as well as in the television and print press. So of course he's trying to shape the way he's covered. In our system, we still have multiple voices, some of which are highly critical of the president, and he hasn't been able to suppress those voices, in part because of the robust free speech tradition that exists in America. Anecdotally, my sense is that there are people in India who aren't as certain that the government isn't able to suppress dissenting voices here. I mean, I hear from time to time that there's some concern that the Indian press is a little cowed by the current government. I can't speak to the truth or falsity of that claim, but it's not the case in America. There are many prominent people that daily attack the president, and that's the system that we come to expect. And if he tried to say, I'm going to put you all in jail, I think people would rise up.
Right, okay. I know, Farah, you wanted to come in. I'll give you 30 seconds to come in on this. We have to open it up to questions after this from the audience. So, yeah. There's one question here, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so let's 4. Wow, okay. There's a lady right here in the red.
Thank you so much for this panel. I know that the title of the panel is nominally about law, but I wanted to ask about how we sort of, in our society, uphold, I don't know, the panopticon, for lack of better terms, especially now that things like cancel culture and on our campus and different campuses, academic freedom is such a prevalent part of the discourse. I was wondering if you could comment on a relationship that you see, or maybe don't see, between how we either self-censor or censor each other, and the relationship that that has with how the state formally upholds the law and free speech. Thank you.
It's a great question. Farah, that's for you, I think. I mean, you can all come in on it, but it seems to be directed to you.
It's a big question. I'm not sure I understand all the ramifications of it. One thing to say, which is a tangential, but I hope partly illuminating answer is free speech is an artificial concept. And it's artificial because if you think of it as an individual right, then you immediately, shorthand for that is we should all be allowed to say the same thing. And actually, in practice, speech is much more complicated than that. And we always, in our daily life, navigating the nuances of who you're speaking to and why you're speaking and who the audience is and how you speak to your children is completely different from how you speak to your crazy, scary new boss. And the intent of speech matters, the audience matters, and so on and so forth. And so the effect of speech in the world is exquisitely contextual, always. And that's one problem for laws for free speech, which tend to want to either strip that away and say everyone has the right to say everything all the time, which doesn't really work, is in conflict with that, how communication really works, or then has to attend to all those contextual complexities, which makes it incredibly complicated, and then you get judges ruling differently in different cases, and it seems inconsistent, and that's, again, a problem for the law. So, on campuses, academic freedom, I don't know where you're talking about, in this country or in the United States? In the United States, yes. There's a huge political hysteria being whipped up over the last 10 or 20 years about university campuses and indoctrination and, lack of freedoms and so on. I've lived and worked in an American campus for 10 years. It's not really like that. It's a misunderstanding. It's a political myth that's trying to denigrate universities and not really understanding and appreciating what they really do, which is advance knowledge and teach people. And the freedom of expression is very powerfully part of academic pursuits, but it's completely unlike what people think of as free speech. It is the opposite of just being able to say whatever the hell you like. It depends on peer review and people getting together and arguing in good faith and with civil norms about no abuse,
so it's like the
no
filtration
lies.
process, like an editorial filter of sorts.
It's editorial filter, yes, exactly. Yeah. And that's what we need for all communication to work. Shared understanding, a collective understanding, a thought about what is this free speech for? Is it to entertain people? Is it for democratic political discourse? Is it for some other purpose? And the rules are going to be different. Lies are very toxic and dangerous in political discourse. They're irrelevant when it comes to fiction and novels and art.
Right.
So those are different kinds of free speech.
Okay, we had one question in the back. Was it from you? Okay, and then one here. This lady here in the, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. I just kind of, I guess, wanted to ask about your thoughts on correlation between kind of this idea of absolutist free speech and kind of more individualistic societies. I mean, we talk about China and, countries even like India that are, I guess, they put regulations on what you can and can't say, and like in China, obviously censorship is a problem, but I think that I wonder when we talk about the United States and being able to say, or the idea that you can say whatever you want, do whatever you want, that's led to kind of, a president being able to say that an election was rigged and people being able to incite violence and an insurrection. And I just wonder kind of the correlation between all of these things and I guess the digital space and how that leads to people being in their silos and their algorithms. And do you think that leads to more individualistic societies where we don't live in community, even though free speech is supposed to be something that brings us together? I hope that makes sense.
Sai, would you also like to comment on that? Because I think what the stuff that she's referring to has also been the subject of presidential pardons.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think in a political society you have to be able to say that the election was stolen, even if we all or most of us think it wasn't. I mean, I think Mr. Gandhi in this country has said there was a problem with the voting machines. I don't know if that's true or not, but I think he should be able to say it. I mean, what if there was a problem with the voting machines? And what if an election was stolen? I don't, again, think the election was stolen, but even in this society, which is less individualistic than the United States, you're able to say these things that some people will think is absolutely false, right? And that other people will take as absolutely true and then do things that we might think are terrible in light of this statement that some of us think are false. So, I think if you're going to have political speech, you have to tolerate the possibility that some things that are going to be said that are wrong. Because otherwise you don't really have political speech. You just have people that are only able to say what the truth is. And the people in power will decide what is truth and what is false. And I don't think you can have a political system.
And the rest of them kind of hang in between without getting bail for 5 years as well. That also happens in this country.
Say that again, Mike?
I said there's people who are accused of violating free speech norms and are sitting in jail for 5 years without bail on charges like that. So yes, some people have the right to say the election might be rigged, but others don't have the. It's a little more subjective.
I mean, I think the Indian system has other features that are being held being held indefinitely without charges. Is not something you can do in the United States. Yeah. I think the defenders of that system would say India faces more challenges than the United States, and critics of that system would deny that that's an appropriate response to the challenges that India faces. It's hard for me to intervene in that debate because although I have a sense of some of the challenges India faces, I don't live under that system.
That's right, yeah.
Can I disagree just very quickly with Sai? I think it's a very simple and I think too problematic, too simple a notion that everyone should just be able to say everything all the time without thinking about the responsibility of the speaker and what kind of speech it is. It is fine to say that individual politicians now and again may disagree with the outcome of an election and raise questions about it. It is not okay for the loser of a presidential election, which was clearly not rigged or false or anything like that, to go out and spread the lie that it was rigged, to refuse to concede, to not basically play by the rule of law, and then to manipulate his entire political party into following this crazy lunatic conspiracy theory, and then to twist everything around to now rewriting history to support a lie. It's a lie. We know it's a lie. Everyone knows it's a lie.
Very quickly, but that's a debate for US politics.
I think there's a difference between saying it is wrong and saying, and therefore it should be banned. And I think you understand that as well, right? And so I'm not saying it was right.
Have a good debate here.
I think that the president lost. Right?
No, he lost. It's not a matter of your opinion.
Yes. Okay, I will stipulate that whatever you're saying is right. My point is, does it follow that we should then criminalize it? I don't even think you're saying that. So I can agree with your point. I don't mean to suggest that there was some silver lining in his statement that he won or that it was rigged or whatever. I'm just saying.
Where do you criminalize?
I'm just saying that politics is a contested space. People say, my policy is the best. And it can't be the case that you should be able to say, well, your policy is objectively wrong. You can't speak about it. Because if that were to happen, then you would just be saying, we can decide ex ante what policies are true and what policies.
So then how does that square up with the pardons that have been granted?
Well, I think we've been talking a lot about freedom of speech, which, is a healthy and interesting topic.
Yeah.
I think, when presidents make pardons, they should be thinking about the situation of the alleged offender, whether they were innocent or not, whether there are mitigating circumstances or not, whether there are real interests of state in forgiving the person to, say, bring a certain number of people back into the fold of the polity, right, to reconcile them, as was done after the Civil War, as is often done after civil wars. There are inappropriate reasons to pardon, including, I like you, you voted for me, you gave me money, right? Those are inappropriate reasons.
You tried to overturn the election in my favor.
Right. You stormed the Capitol, and I like the fact that you stormed the Capitol. I think those are inappropriate reasons. In our system, the Constitution doesn't police inappropriate for appropriate reasons. It doesn't have a mechanism for doing that, and you can try to create a mechanism. It's hard to think about what would that mean, right? If you had a constitutional provision which said you can only pardon for appropriate reasons, then you'd have to have someone decide whether this was an appropriate reason or not, which of course would then be contested, right? But it's not that you couldn't imagine this.
No, it's quite all right. I was just going to say, this is a role that the courts play. We try to listen to the information provided and then make a decision. And, you know, there's a check and balance in that system.
Right.
And ultimately, if courts can be a place where people could come and present their evidence and facts, and then it's adjudicated. Now, the problem becomes, do you trust that decision? And that is a problem that we are dealing with.
Right. So I think the question of trust actually underpins what all three of you are saying in a sense, because what is the intent of speech in the case of what Farah is saying? What is the intent of the pardon, and how is it perceived in what Sai is saying? And of course, you have to contend with your plaintiffs and defendants, and decide who the court trusts while making a decision. So these are complicated questions, undoubtedly. I think we have time for two more questions. One from here. One more question? Oh, just one more question. Sorry, that's you. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I found it interesting how a panel supposedly on the power and perils of law became one about free speech. But I think you've tried to link it up by talking about trust. I think I want to talk about politics, because that's the elephant in the room. And I have a two-part question. The first one is, we talk a lot about weaponized disinformation or misinformation. But what is the scope of the very idea of free speech being weaponized against free societies by authoritarian societies in a Cold War 2.0 situation? So that's the first question. And the second question has to do with lawfare. To what extent does politics interfere in the process of law, in the due process of justice, and result in distortions, some of which are known by the term lawfare? Thank you.
I mean, I think both of you have touched upon those, but do you want to just, all of you, take a quick...
The first question is answered in this splendid book. You guys do the second question.
Would you like to respond?
I think we as courts try to insulate ourselves from being influenced by public pressure or politics. It's an ongoing battle. We're human beings, we get influenced, but we try to avoid that because we know just exactly what you're saying. The trust in our rulings is underpinned by people trusting us in making a fair and unbiased decision. And we have to guard against that. We have to try to insulate ourselves from those pressures so that we can be accepted by whoever comes to us. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, but you can accept our decision.
Sai, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, I think lawfare is a problem because it implies that people are being prosecuted because they're the opposition. And that's definitely happening to some extent in America. And
Also
it's
here.
said to be happening here as well.
Yeah.
On the other hand, sometimes politicians have done things that are criminal, right? And have done things that violate the law. Yes. And it can't be the case that because they're politicians, they can't be prosecuted. And the trick is to figure out when are politicians being prosecuted for political reasons as opposed to, the good reasons, the sound reasons. And that's a problem of perception. My sense in America is that is some problem of lawfare that goes beyond merely thinking that some politician has done something improper. But that itself, my judgment, of course, is contested.
Thank you so much. I think I'm getting cues from the side to wrap up the panel, but it's been wonderful talking to all of you. I learned a lot. I hope you all did too. There are many parallels on these debates that are going on across the world, and we can take that maybe back to the Authors Lounge and continue the discussion. But once again, thank you so much, all of you, for being part of this panel.